Have you ever lived through the phrase, "what goes around comes around"? Well, Netflix's latest release uses the tool of magical realism to make you chew on that thought by painting the fate of a desolate town forced to bite the dust after being trampled over by a terrible feudal lord. Juan Rulfo's 1955 novel Pedro Páramo is a cornerstone of Latin American literature and is often celebrated in English-speaking circles as a major influence on Gabriel García Márquez. But for true fans of the book, it stands on its own as a surrealist masterpiece, a haunting story told with striking simplicity. Adapting Juan Rulfo's story would be a huge challenge for any filmmaker, especially a first-time director. But in his adaptation, Rodrigo Prieto takes more of a straightforward approach, and instead of leaning into the novel's dreamlike metaphysical qualities, he offers up a more conventional, grounded western. He takes us on a deeply personal journey, embedded in the elements of Mexican magical realism, as one man tries to uncover his family's buried secrets. While this Netflix hopeful for international feature can feel a bit packed and fragmented, staying true to the novel's nonlinear style, it's not hard to get swept up in the beauty of its magical realism. So without wasting another moment, let's discuss this fever dream of a film. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. What is Pedro Páramo about? The film opens with a weary traveler named Juan Preciado navigating a barren land when he comes across a muleteer named Abundio and asks him the route to the village of Comala. We then learn that Juan was fulfilling a promise he made to his mother on her deathbed and is on his way to her hometown with the hopes of confronting the father he never knew. Juan was hoping to make his father, Pedro Páramo, pay for the neglect he'd shown to his wife and son. But oh well. Things take quite a turn when the muleteer tells him that he too was the son of Pedro Páramo, and that Comala is now an abandoned village without a single inhabitant in it. After showing him the way to the village, Abundio asks Juan to look for a woman named Dona Eduviges, who runs the local boarding house. Once he walks through the village, Juan is almost creeped out by the desolate emptiness of the town, and how it feels run down by ghosts. Eventually, Juan is led to Eduviges, where he's given a room in the attic. When Eduviges tells Juan how his mother had mentioned his arrival, he mentions that it was impossible as she'd recently passed. Weirdly enough, the woman responded, saying it made sense why Juan's mother's voice was so faint. Before leaving him to settle down in the attic, she also mentioned how ruthless his father was, and the fact that just like Comala, Pedro Páramo was also dead. Eduviges then asked Juan to come down for a meal, and before we get any more answers, the film jumps back to a different time in Comala, when it was a lush, green town instead of the dry wasteland Juan Preciado found. Here we see a young boy daydreaming inside the washroom, while his mother bickers. We then see him flying a kite with a young girl and running across the field alongside her. They seem pretty happy together until the girl leaves Comala with her father, leaving the boy utterly heartbroken and alone. Given his harsh surroundings, the boy seems simply too idealistic and refuses to do any form of work that his family puts him to. At first, we think this might be a young Preciado, but soon we realize it's actually a young Pedro Páramo, whose story in the film begins to unfold in fragments, showing us how heartbreak and ambition slowly turned him into the ruthless man that Juan is now searching for. In the present day, we see Eduviges tell Juan how she almost became his mother. Apparently, when Juan's mother was about to marry Pedro Páramo, a fortune teller told her not to share a bed with a man while she was on her period. So, as a solution, she insisted Eduviges take her place for the night. Given how drunk Pedro was, he immediately passed out on the bed and didn't even notice who was sleeping beside him. Juan also learned that his mother was probably ashamed of her husband, which is why she only told him the good stuff about Comala. She hated the man as he only ever barked orders at her, and even when she got used to his rudeness, she would often express her rage by sighing. That only made their relationship worse, and ultimately Pedro sent her to live with her sister. We then have another flashback to Pedro Páramo's childhood, where his crying mother wakes him up in the morning to inform him that his father had been murdered by intruders in the dead of night. In the present, Eduviges tells Juan about the sound of galloping horses, and how it means that Miguel Paramo was on his way to Media Luna. He then learns that Pedro fathered many sons, but Miguel was the only one he acknowledged as his own son. In another scene, a young man knocks on Eduviges' door, and it turns out he was Miguel Páramo, who was there to tell her that Contla, the place where her lover lived, did not exist, because every time he tried to get there, he would get trapped in endless smoke. We soon learn that Miguel was dead, and it's probably his confused ghost visiting Eduviges in search for answers. Following this, we open to the scene of Miguel's funeral, where a priest performs a ceremony so his soul might pass on peacefully. After this, Father Renteria goes home for supper, and we find out that his niece has been raped by Miguel. Apparently, Miguel had also murdered her father, and when she learns that Father Renteria had given the rites of absolution to the sinner, it leaves her hopeless. On the next day, a woman arrives begging for Renteria's help. Apparently, her sister has been suffering for a very long time, so she committed suicide after not being able to withstand the pain. She begs the priest to save her sister's soul, but then Renteria tells her that the entire ritual would be very expensive, as he needed him to bring in priests from out of town for the ceremony. Because the woman was poor, Father Renteria tells her that there was nothing he could do and to calm her down. He asked her to go home and pray for her sister's soul. We then get a glimpse at the funeral where all the women are crying, surrounding a coffin, and the ultimate shock comes when we realize that the woman laying in the coffin was Eduvejes herself. At this point in the film, nothing is really making sense, but again, we're taken to the current timeline of Comala, where Eduvejes is asking Juan if he has ever heard the groan of a soul. When he denies, she simply says it's better that way and vanishes. Naturally, Juan goes looking for her and stumbles upon a woman named Damiana, who claimed that she knew he had come to Comala and came to find him. After realizing that this woman was his old babysitter, Juan leaves with Damiana as Eduvejes' boarding house gave him the creeps. On his way with Damiana, Juan learns about his father's treacherous past, how Pedro Páramo married his mother for money and then rose to power as the feudal lord of Comala. He cheated peasants and tortured everyone and anyone in town to gain more money and influence. And anyone who tried to raise their voice against Pedro ended up dead. Fulgor was the man who did all of Don Pedro Páramo's dirty work and enforced tyranny on the villagers on his boss's behalf. After taking him to the Paramo house, Damiana tells Juan that she was the head housemaid of all of Pedro's servants, as she was the only maid who had the self-respect of not sleeping with him. Juan then asks how Damiana knew he was coming to Comala house, and before he could get his answer, the woman simply vanished into thin air. Basically, in what we would call the present, Comala is teeming with ghosts, making it feel more like a halfway house for the dead than a real town. What Juan thought was an abandoned village is actually full of spirits, and as he explores Comala, he realizes he's been led into a world where the past still reverberates, haunting every corner, blurring the line between life and afterlife. Even if Damiana tells him that he cannot imagine the crowd of souls that roam the streets, Juan Preciado doesn't have to imagine them. At times, he can see them himself, drifting through the streets like echoes of the past. As the story unfolds, it becomes increasingly strange and dreamlike, and Juan, our guide into this eerie world, essentially fades from view. The focus then shifts fully onto Pedro Páramo himself, as we witness his ruthless climb to power, how he saved himself from bankruptcy by marrying into Comala's wealthiest family, only to later send his wife away in order to do as he wished. Though the older Páramo may look unassuming, he was as cunning as they come. But still, Pedro harbored a deep obsession for his childhood love, and eventually she returned to Comala, but as a woman who was now aged, weary, and lost in her own memories. The film becomes a haunting exploration of loss and longing that festers into hatred, revealing how Páramo's evil deeds set off a chain of destruction that eventually consumes him too. He strikes deals with revolutionaries, orders town-wide mourning that erupts into wild celebrations, and slowly loses control over the forces he's unleashed. I think because of the drastic nonlinear storytelling, the film slips in and out of time in ways that can be beautifully poetic or downright confusing. Did Juan ever manage to get out of the ghost town of Comala? Driven by a desire to confront the father his mother sent him to find, Juan arrives in the ghostly town of Comala without even thinking why the town is so abandoned. He quickly learns that his father is dead. Now that he's stranded and unsure where to go, he decides to spend the night there. Soon he meets the local woman, Dona Eduvejes, who begins sharing stories about his father and mother, sparking his curiosity. Yet as they talk, Juan senses something strange and unsettling. When Eduvejes vanishes, Juan starts feeling wary, so he chooses to leave with another woman he happens upon, hoping for a clearer path forward. When the woman turns out to be Juan's old nanny, her presence brings a certain sense of comfort, until of course he realizes she's a ghost. Panicked, he tries to flee, but quickly becomes lost in the winding streets of Comala. Fear grips him as he encounters more lifelike ghosts who kill and murder people in front of him, apparently on his late father Pedro Páramo's orders. The violence drives Juan crazy and makes him desperate to escape. In his frantic attempt to leave the town, he stumbles upon a couple, who he later learns are actually siblings. But this pair is as unsettling as everyone else in Comala, as they sleep naked on the bed hugging one another. Juan's suspicions of them being ghosts are confirmed when the woman tells him that he was now trapped with her, before turning into a pile of mud. Desperate and scared, Juan manages to escape their house, only to find himself hallucinating as he stumbles into the town square, where he sees the spirits of his father's victims hovering above him. They were mostly naked bodies of the women that Pedro Páramo had raped or slept with. Surrounded by the ghosts pressing in closer, Juan eventually becomes overwhelmed and struggles to breathe, until finally he dies, overcome by asphyxiation. Why did Comala turn into a ghost town? As Pedro Páramo rose to power, he seized control of Comala, driving the entire town into ruin under his corrupt rule. His reign of tyranny was marked by corruption, adultery, violence, and murder. Even though he seemed to be a mild-mannered man, Pedro was awfully diplomatic, tactical, and cutthroat. He barely had any remorse, and reveled in his prowess by keeping the population of Comala under his boot, by threatening their families, killing their men, and raping their women. Comala eventually became a victim of the havoc caused by Pedro and his loyal followers. He even went as far as funding and manipulating the Mexican Revolution to serve his own interests, further adding to the chaos. But when the only woman he ever loved died, something in Pedro snapped. One of the most crucial figures in Pedro Páramo is Susana San Juan, the love of Pedro's life, his childhood companion, and the person who stirs his deepest, darkest desires. His love for her is all-consuming and destructive, pushing him towards some of his worst actions. After leaving Comala as a child, Susana returns following her husband's death, only to find herself trapped by Pedro's obsessive idealization of her. Haunted by grief and trauma, she barely speaks and rejects any of his attempts to win her over. Even after marrying him, she doesn't align herself with the role he envisions for her as a devoted wife. She's too lost in her memories, too centered in her own mind to care for his demands. Even Pedro hopes for her love, and after her death, he loses his natural state of being. After Father Renteria rang the church bell all day long to honor Susana's death, people from outside started joining Comala in its grief. But soon this grief turned into an endless celebration, which prompted Don Pedro Páramo to become indifferent to the town's fate, and eventually, as a result, Comala fell apart, with its residents either abandoning it or meeting untimely deaths. How did Pedro Páramo meet his end? After losing the only woman he ever truly loved, Pedro Páramo sank into grief and began to grow indifferent to Comala. His apathy deepened when a crowd from nearby towns gathered in Comala, drawn by the church bells the priest had rung. What started as a gathering quickly turned into a celebration, clashing painfully with Pedro's sorrow. Enraged by this insensitivity, Pedro fully withdrew from the town's needs, allowing it to slip into neglect and eventual decay. Pedro spent his final days as a hollow shell of himself, often sitting in front of his house, staring into the distance where Susana had departed on her final journey. One day, while he sat in his wicker chair lost in thought, one of his illegitimate sons appeared at his door, drunk and desperate. Now, this is the same son, Abundio, whose ghost guided Juan to Comala when he first arrived. Abundio pleaded with Pedro to help him bury his dead wife, but Pedro's cold indifference enraged him. In a fit of anger, he stabbed Pedro and Damiana, who had tried to intervene. And with that, Pedro Páramo's tragic story ended as he looked towards the pathway to Comala one last time, before breathing his last. Marvelous verdict. Pedro Páramo is definitely Pedro's story, but beyond that, I'm not entirely sure what the movie is trying to say. It feels like a mystery wrapped in a riddle. Sure, you could interpret it as a commentary on how wealth doesn't shield you from psychological or physical suffering. Pedro's casual treatment of women, impregnating them and then ignoring them, seems to say something about the role of women in a man's world. And the ghosts? They might be a metaphor for how scars of classism linger, never truly fading away. But honestly, the film's confusing, non-linear storytelling undermines any of these ideas. The constant talk of land, impurity, politics, revolution, and death just dragged on without drawing me in. To make matters worse, the movie throws out that tired, everything might be in the character's head twist more than once, leaving you wondering if the director thought, if you can't convince them, confuse them. But that's just my opinion. What do you think about this film? And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone!